Hi, this is our second video of the respiratory system. During the first video, we talked about what respiration is and gave an overview of the upper respiratory tract, which ends at the trachea, then started talking about the lower respiratory tract, which begins at the trachea. So we talked about the trachea being cartilaginous and what these cartilaginous ridges do. So we mentioned the carina, which is located right here. That splits the trachea into the left and right sides. So that's where we'll begin here with the lower respiratory tract after the trachea. So we'll be talking about the lungs, and here's a diagram of the gross anatomy of the lungs. So we'll be talking about the different lobes as well as the apex versus the base, and the mediastinal surfaces and how these interact with the main bronchi. And we'll also talk about the different lobes. Like I said, here's one of the lungs with the different lobes, with arteries. So the lungs have, just like the heart, they have a base and an apex, with the base being the broad part resting on the diaphragm. So that's the part that's most inferior, and the apex being the tip that projects to above the clavicle, and that's the superior part. There's also the costal surface, which is pressed against the rib cage. Anytime you see that prefix, that costal right here, that's going to refer to the rib cage itself. And there's also the mediastinal surface, which faces medially towards the heart. You have the hilum, which is the slit through which the lung receives the main bronchus, the blood vessels, lymphatics, as well as nerves. And the structures near the hilum constitute the root of the lung. So the lungs are pretty crowded by adjacent organs. They don't fill the entire rib cage, and they're not symmetrical. So the right lung is shorter than the left because of the liver, which rises higher on the right. And the right lung has three different lobes: the superior, middle, and the inferior lobes. These are separated by horizontal and oblique fissures. The left lung is tall and narrow because of the heart, which tilts towards the left and occupies more space on this side of the mediastinum. It has an indentation, which is called the cardiac impression, which allows for the heart. It has two lobes, which are superior and inferior, and they're separated by one single oblique fissure. So remember, right lung, 3 lobes, left lung, 2 lobes. So the bronchial tree is a branching system of air tubes in each lung, and these come from the main bronchus, which comes off of the trachea, and then it goes to 65,000 terminal bronchioles. Kind of think of them as being like a tree with different branches. The main primary bronchi are supported by hyaline cartilage rings, which are also found in the trachea. The right main bronchus is a branch that's 2 or 3 centimeters long and comes from the right fork of the trachea. The right bronchus is slightly wider and more vertical than the left, and that's because the right lung has 3 lobes versus the left lung having 2. So inhaled foreign objects lodge in the right main bronchus more often than the left. The left main bronchus is about 5 centimeters long, so it's longer, but it's also slightly narrower and more horizontal than the right. The lobar, or second bronchi, are supported by crescent-shaped cartilage plates that are kind of like the hyaline cartilage, but not as large. There are 3 right lobar or secondary bronchi, which are the superior, middle, and inferior, and they each go to a lobe in the right lung. Likewise, there are 2 left lobar bronchi, which are superior and inferior, and they go to each lobe of the left lung. From there are segmental or tertiary bronchi, which are also supported by cartilage plates. And there are 10 on the right, 8 on the left. The bronchopulmonary segment is functionally independent unit of the lung tissue, and this is where it begins. So all bronchi are lined with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. Cells are able to grow shorter, and the epithelial tissue is thinner as we progress distally, meaning away from the lungs. The lamina propria has an abundance of mucus glands and lymphocyte nodules. Remember, we talked about MALT, or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. and these are positioned to intercept inhaled pathogens as a line of defense. All of the divisions of the bronchial tree have a large amount of elastic connective tissue, which contributes to the recoil that allows air to be expelled from the lungs. The mucosa layer, the mucosa has a well-developed layer of smooth muscle. The muscularis mucosae contracts or relaxes to constrict or dilate the airway, which then can allow for the regulation of airflow. The pulmonary artery branches closely following the bronchial tree on their way to the alveoli. The bronchial artery services the bronchial tree with systemic blood and arises from the aorta. Bronchioles are pretty small. They're about 1 millimeter or less in diameter. A pulmonary lobule is a portion of lung that's ventilated by one bronchiole. So this is part of the larger lobes. These bronchioles have ciliated cuboidal epithelium and a well-developed layer of smooth muscle. They then divide into 50 to 80 terminal bronchioles. These are the final branches of the conducting zone. Remember, the difference between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone is that the conducting zone functions to deliver air, whereas the respiratory zone is where gas exchange happens. These are about 0.5 millimeter or even less, and they don't have mucus glands or goblet cells that would secrete the mucus. They do have cilia that move mucus that drains into them back by the mucociliary escalator. Remember, we talked about that. That's beating the mucus upwards so that we can then swallow it. Each terminal bronchiole gives off 2 or more smaller respiratory bronchioles, and this is where the gas exchange will occur. So the respiratory bronchioles are the beginning of the respiratory exchange, and these have alveoli budding from their walls. This is considered, again, to be the beginning of the respiratory zone because of the alveoli participating in gas exchange. These then divide into 2 to 10 alveolar ducts and end in alveolar sacs, which are clusters of alveoli arranged around a central space called the atrium. If you think about the tree, these could be thought of as maybe the leaves. So here we can see the histology of the lung. So we can see the alveoli here, which are those tiny little air sacs where gas exchange occurs, bronchial cartilage with a mucosal lining with smooth muscle underneath it, and this is a tertiary bronchus. Here we can see them again, the bronchiole bringing air into the little alveoli sacs. So alveoli themselves, there are about 150 million alveoli in each lung, which allows for 70 meters squared of surface for gas exchange. So that's one of their main functions, is to provide a large amount of surface for gas exchange. The cells of the alveoli are squamous type 1 alveolar cells, which are thin, broad cells that allow for rapid gas diffusion between the alveoli and the bloodstream, and they cover most of the surface area. There are also great type 2 cells that are round to cuboidal cells that cover the remaining portion of the alveolar surface, and these function to repair the alveolar epithelium when the squamous or type 1 cells are damaged. They also secrete pulmonary surfactant, which is a mixture of phospholipids and proteins that coats the alveoli and prevents them from collapsing during exhalation, where they might stick upon one another. So there are also alveolar macrophages, which are called dust cells, and these are the most numerous of all the cells in the lungs. And these wander in the spaces of the alveoli and the connective tissue between them. And this keeps the alveoli free from different debris by phagocytizing any sort of particles that could come in there. About 100 million dust cells die each day while they go up that mucociliator escalator to be swallowed and digested with the debris that they contain. So here we can see the alveoli. So here's the alveoli itself with the different little sacs that allow for the gas exchange. And you can see a dense amount of capillary networks around the alveoli, which again aids with gas exchange. And here we see the terminal bronchiole that ends with the alveoli. So each alveolus is surrounded by a basket of capillaries that's supplied by the pulmonary artery. The respiratory membrane is the thin barrier between the alveolar air and blood. And the respiratory membrane consists of squamous alveolar cells, endothelial cells of the blood capillary, and then a shared basement membrane that allows them for it to be tightly linked. So it's important to prevent fluid from accumulating in the alveoli. So if there is liquid, then the gas will diffuse too slowly through the liquid to aerate the blood. The alveoli are kept dry by absorbing excess liquid by blood capillaries. The lungs also have a more extensive lymphatic drainage system than any other organ in the body so that they can quickly absorb and get rid of that liquid. There's also low capillary blood pressure within the lungs, which also prevents the rupture of the delicate respiratory membrane. So here we have a picture of the respiratory membrane, which has the surfactant fluid, the squamous alveolar cells, and some lymphocytes hanging out in there. There's also the capillary epithelial cell and that shared basement membrane there. And this is where gas exchange occurs. So much like the heart, the lungs have membranes that cover the lungs. So there are visceral pleura, which is a serous membrane that covers the lungs. And then there's the parietal pleura, which adheres to the mediastinum, which is the inner surface of the rib cage, and the superior surface of the diaphragm. So this gives rise to the pleural cavity, which is the potential space between these two pleura. Usually there's no room between those membranes, but there's some slippery pleural fluid. So the functions of the pleura and pleural fluid is to reduce friction, create the pressure gradient where there's lower pressure than atmospheric pressure, and that assists lung inflation. And then it also helps to compartmentalize the body. So it prevents the spread of infection from one organ in the mediastinum to others, like the heart.